start off a speech by saying 407 years ago, you would know what I'm talking about, right? But the speech starts off by saying 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men, and let's put some quotes there, and women are created equal. But did you know that also that the beginning of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address also prompted Martin Luther King to start off his famous I Have a Dream speech with a very similar beginning, where he says 50 years ago, a great American, referring to Lincoln, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. These first lines that are often spoken in speeches, sometimes some of these lines live on for generations, sparking others to remember them, to use them. First lines that we remember, like the Emancipation Proclamation, are ones that that conjure up good things for us. Now, for us here today, if I were to start off by saying, Our Father, the rest of your mind fills in those gaps, right? What comes next of that line? Everyone else chimes in. But I say the Our Father by myself, and then you all join in with the Lord's Prayer. Now, we're starting a new sermon series based on the Lord's Prayer. When we start off by saying, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Meaning, our Father who is in heaven, let your name be revered. Let your name be marked as holy. But honestly, when we say this every single Sunday, does the name of God actually matter to you? Does God's name have any meaning to you in your life? So I ask you the question, does it matter to you? Now, I'm not a big 10 Commandments guy, but in this case, it matters to our topic for today. The third commandment says to not use the Lord's name in vain. What this is really doing is telling people or asking people to say that we respect and fear God so much that we're not even going to use God's name in vain because we respect God and we fear God so much. Now, maybe you've never thought of that, or maybe it's not something that you really care much about. But does that matter to you? Do you respect and do you fear God? Like a king who rules over us, do we respect God's name? Do we respect God's rightful place as our king? Does it even matter to you? Does it even matter to the world? One of the biggest critiques of the church in the United States is that it has lost touch with society. And this is very much true. And this is a critique that we need to take with a grain of salt, that we need to take seriously. A lot of the questions that we mull over, that we have theological debate over, often doesn't meet people where they actually are. That we don't meet people in the ways that we need it. That we are so concerned with things that don't really matter to the average person that we have just simply lost touch. This was the same critique that Jesus had of the religious leaders at the time, that they were so caught up in debating the letter of the law that they had forgotten the spirit of the law. They had forgotten what the law was supposed to do. So no, of course not. When it mattered, we ask the question, does the name of God matter to the world? Of course it doesn't matter to the world. It has lost meaning in the world because in the eyes of so many people, the Christian church has lost meaning and has lost sight of its purpose. And so overall, the name of God probably hasn't found a meaningful place in our lives and has lost a meaningful place in the world. It's lost meaning in the world because Christianity and Christians have lost touch with the world. And in so many instances, to too many people across our globe, that the name has caused more harm than good. Even in Christian circles, the name of God, it's too overly adjudicated, too overly placed in a do this, do not do this context. Don't do this context. Like, use the name of God. Use Jesus' name at the end of your prayers. Don't use Jesus' name in the wrong context. Definitely don't use God's name when you're cursing. That it's been so overly adjudicated, too overly placed in a do or do not do this context that it's just a conversation. It's just a conversation, and it has really no impact upon the world. So what do we do with the topic that A, either has little to no meaning to believers today, or B, is so overly stressed that it misses the point and has really no practical application to us today? Or C, that it just doesn't really matter to those who are outside the Christian faith? What do we even do with something like that? What do we do with a topic that doesn't really matter that much to a lot of people? But I hope that after today, that one, for all of you, that it matters in a different way, because it mattered to Jesus. And so we have two texts for today, both around the statement of I am. One from the Old Testament and one from the New Testament. So I invite you to follow along. The words will be on the screen, and it's also in your bulletins. And our first text comes from Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. And it says this: Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land, to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has come now to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. Now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you, that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So Moses he deserves his rightful place in our teaching and how we respect him. But this is Moses at the very beginning. He's uncertain. Okay, let's just call it what it is. He's uncertain. One, he's uncertain of if the Israelites, if they're going to believe him, a guy like Moses, that are they really going to believe that he was sent from God? Now, Moses actually throughout Exodus chapter 3 has a lot of different objections and uncertainties about being summoned to the task that God is calling him to do. First, he asks, who am I? Who am I that I should be the one to go? Like, what authority do I have? I killed a man in Egypt. I haven't been with my people for 40 years. Who am I? What value do I have in doing this task? Now, there's a whole sermon in there, I admit, so I'm not going to preach that sermon. But ultimately, God equips those whom God calls. God answers Moses' first objection by saying that I will be with you. But then Moses objects again. That's not good enough for Moses, okay? That's not good enough for him. I like Moses' humanness in this story. Instead of asking about, who am I that you are sending me, he then asks something about God. What is your name? Who is sending me? What authority do you have that the people will listen to me? Because there's ultimately authority in a name. If you were to get a letter from someone by the name of John Doe that has summoned you to come to their house at this time, you might be like, I don't know this person. I'm not going to go to that person's house. Now, if the President of the United States summons you, you're going to be there, right? And you're going to show up probably in your best outfit that you have. So here God declares that his name is I am who I am, meaning that I am the one who has always existed. I am the one who is. This is tied to seeing God as the creator of heaven and earth. It is tied to God's eternal nature. God has always existed and will always exist. But here's where the reverence comes in. Here's where God's name is holy. Here's also where our English language falls flat. In verse 15, and I invite you to actually look at this in your bulletins. I made sure that our office admin, Betty, made sure that this was in there. That in our English Bibles, it capitalizes all the letters in the word Lord. The L, the O, the R, the D. It's always capitalized there. Because it's trying to communicate that the Hebrew that it is that it is translating is the letters capital Y, capital H, capital W, capital H. That is what is written in Hebrew because of how holy God's name is. In Hebrew, it reads from right to left. So the Y is that little apostrophe looking thing. That the capital letters Y, H, W, H is something called the tetragrammaton. That God's name is so revered, it is so holy that they wouldn't even write the vowels in Hebrew, so that the name of God couldn't even be pronounced. At best, what we have are guesses as to what God's name could be. And in fact, an entire religion comes from this mystery of what is God's name? What are the vowels tied to God's name so that we may pronounce God's name? That in the religion of the Jehovah's Witnesses, that the vowels were added, they take God's name into 3 syllables, Jehovah. But most scholars think that it is 2 syllables, and that the name is Yahweh, with the A and an E being the vowels. Both come from this mystery of not knowing God's name, so that we cannot pronounce God's name, so that we cannot use God's name in vain. God's name was so revered, so holy, that whatever pronunciation was actually God's name, whatever pronunciation of the tetragrammaton was correct, that it was only spoken by the high priest in the Holy of Holies one day of the year. That the reverence for the tetragrammaton is held so lightly that whenever this Hebrew text is written on anything, even like regular printer paper, that a modern day rabbi would have to discard it in a way that was sacramental. But here's what I want us to know. The tetragrammaton, the name for God, is the highest form of a proper noun, where all the letters in it are capitalized. Even in English, all the letters are capitalized. The name for God is a proper noun, but Jesus makes it into a verb. And this is what I want to highlight. This is what I want us to know. This is what I want you to remember from this sermon. That Jesus takes God's proper name, and simply because of who Jesus is, Jesus turns it into a verb. So our second text comes from John chapter 8, verse 58, which says, Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, before Abraham was, I am." Now I was blown away when I was thinking about this in John's gospel, because John, the gospel writer, has an understanding and a vision and a way of seeing Jesus unlike any of the other gospel writers. And this is a bit complicated, so I was like, do I even try and preach this or not? So try and stay with me, okay? I'm going to lead you down this path. Try and stay with me, because this is a little bit complicated. So John's gospel starts off in chapter 1. He places Jesus, the second member as the Trinity. John places him into the creation story. Not the human Jesus, but the divine person of Jesus. He places him into the creation story. And if you've heard the beginning of John's gospel, it says this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. Now, my interpretation of what the gospel writer John is saying is that Jesus, not the person Jesus, but the divine nature of Jesus, was in the creation story. Remember, God the Creator, God the Father, and then God the Son. The second person of the Trinity is in the creation story. And how? John identifies Jesus being the words that came from God's mouth. When God says, "Let there be light," and God said, and God spoke that John identifies that the words coming out of God the Father's mouth is Jesus, is what John is saying. That as God initiates, Jesus is the action of God in creation. And so this is what makes it complicated. To the gospel writer, Jesus, I think John sees Jesus as the action of God in the world. That God the Father initiates, God the Son is the action happening. And this is what I believe John is stating at the beginning of his gospel, that Jesus also co-creates with God, that the words that come from God's mouth, when God says, "Let there be light, let the waters separate, and let there be dry land," that Jesus is the Word making that happen. And so when we come to Jesus declaring, "I am," he is very intentionally declaring that he is God. And he's very intentionally using the story in Exodus 3 by invoking the name of God. When God says, "I am who I am," Jesus is very intentionally saying that I am as well. But Jesus states it in a verbal form. Before Abraham was, I am. And this is so interesting to me because Jesus takes the proper name for God, takes Yahweh, takes the tetragrammaton, and states that he is the verb form. Just like he was the action of God in the creation story, Jesus continues to be the action of God's name in the world. That the existence and the eternity of God, the creating power of God, that is being manifested and is moving through the person of Jesus. If God is the initiator, then Jesus is the initiation of that action. But what does that have to do with us? That's interesting, Pastor Eric. What does that have to do with me in my daily life? What does it have to do with God's name being revered as holy? And why should we even care? The thing is that the name of God is upon all of us. It's not a theological debate about, is God Jehovah, is God Yahweh, how should we refer to God? But what I think that this text is saying is that Jesus brings reverence to the name and how Jesus lives. And so we bring reverence to God's name and how we live as a people who are marked by God's name in this world. This isn't about holding our tongues and not using God's name in vain and condemning people that use God's name in vain. But that it's about not bringing vanity to the fact that we as Christians are living in this world. That we don't take that name in vain. That the action that we live in this world is not taken in vain. That as Jesus manifested God's name through his life and teaching and sacrifice on the cross and through his resurrection, that everything that we do in our life either brings reverence to God's name or not. As Jesus was all about his Father's business, as Jesus declared that he is I am, just as God declared I am who I am, we declare that to the world that I am because of who Jesus is. That Jesus is within me and therefore I am. That Jesus is my Lord and my God, therefore I am. That Jesus loved the least of these, and that I'm going to do that too. That as Jesus sought to actionize God's name, that we actionize God's name into the world too. That to make God's name as holy is not to condemn people that use the Lord's name in vain, that we bring holiness to the world because we live as God's people who are identified by the name of God. To take God's name in reverence is to live like Jesus, to show society that love has come through what we do as Christians. When we pray, hallowed be thy name, let us strive to make God's name hallowed by being like Jesus in this world. Now, this Christian artist, his name is Matt Redman, and he sought to bring a deeper understanding of God's name during a time of immense national grief that was going through this nation. And the song that he created is called Blessed Be Your Name. And those words, blessed be your name, compose the entire chorus of the song. Not only, even though this song is upbeat, but not only does this song communicate what the first line of the Lord's Prayer communicates in terms of blessing God's name, in terms of bringing reverence to God's name, but the reason for why it was written was so that our nation could find songs that helped us lament and express our collective pain. While he was leading worship in a variety of different churches, he saw that there just weren't any contemporary Christian songs that allowed people to express just negative emotion tied to God, lament, grief, that there weren't any songs that were allowing people to express that. And so his song, Blessed Be Your Name, expresses our blessing of God's names through times of abundance, but also during times of hurt, in times of the wilderness, of going through the desert places, of going through darkness. And then it also says when there's pain in the offering, when we're only able to offer pain to God, that we could still bless God's name, that we could still revere God's holy name. He wanted Christians to be able to hold on to God, even in the hard times, and despite what was happening all around them. And he wrote this song 20 years ago. And he wrote this song after the events of 9/11, because the nation was going through collective grief, and there just weren't many songs to express that grief. And as Jesus is close to those who are hurting, who are in the valleys of life, we cannot shy away from being near to those who are hurting, just like this song was for a nation that was hurting. And so naturally, as we are worshiping here today on the Sunday following 9/11, 23 years after, oddly enough, also with a sermon about God's name, we're going to sing the song, Blessed Be Your Name. And oddly enough, it falls into an interesting place in that it's old enough that Chloe didn't know the song, but I still consider it to be contemporary. And it's too new of a song to be in your hymnals or in the faith you sing. So it's in this weird void place that maybe millennials and Gen Xers know. And so with that, it is new. It is new to pretty much everyone here.